Thank you very much, Sergio, and thank you to the Toronto Public Library for having us today, and to all of you for tuning in. I'm very excited to do the third in the series of 4 lectures about Toronto's most notorious. Today, we're talking about bank robbers and bandits, which is one of the talks in the series I've most been looking forward to because there are a ton of stories sort of centering around this theme. So it's been a lot of fun to get to dive into that a little bit more and learn even more about it. I'm very excited to share these stories with you today. Let me just find my slides and we will launch into the stories with our very first bank robbery. Now, this story starts here on Broadview Avenue one summer day in August of 1940. What seemed to be an ordinary Friday afternoon, just a little after noon itself, at a branch of the Canadian Bank of Commerce of CIBC that stood on Broadview just south of Gerrard. In fact, this building is still there today. It's now home to an architectural firm, but back then was home to this CIBC branch where our first drama of the afternoon broke out a little after lunch on that Friday afternoon, and centered around this man, the bank teller. Working inside the bank was a man named Gifford Hobday. He was in the cage at his desk helping a customer. He was checking over a deposit slip and was so focused on his task that he didn't even realize what was happening at first. A man had come up and shoved the customer Hobday was helping out of the way. Hobday didn't really notice, and when he heard a voice say something about a holdup, he just thought it was a couple of people making idle conversation, didn't pay much attention to it at all. But when that voice spoke again, maybe a little more insistent this time, and said once more, "This is a holdup," this time, Gifford Hobday looked up and found himself staring down the barrel of a gun. This guy had come to rob the bank. Now, bank robberies were weirdly common once upon a time in Toronto, as we'll see a little bit today. The Toronto police eventually even started their own hold-up squad about a decade after this, a decade or two actually, specifically to respond to sort of the big surge in armed bank robberies. But a lot of bank tellers didn't actually wait for the police to show up, and Gifford was one of them. He got his opportunity pretty quickly. The customer who'd been shoved out of the way, he didn't understand what was happening either. He thought the whole thing must be a joke. He said something like, "What the hell's going on?" to the bandit. And that bank robber then turned toward the customer, which gave Gifford his opening. There was a gun in his desk too. And so he grabbed the pistol in that moment while the bank robber was distracted and started firing. He would later tell the Toronto Star that he really didn't know how to fire a gun. He didn't have much practice in it at all, but figured this was probably a good time to learn. And he didn't need to be a great shot because it was point blank range. His first bullet went into the bandit's shoulder. The bank robber crumpled to the ground, but in the moment he was hit, his gun went off too and hit Gifford in the shoulder. And as he fell to the ground at the same time the bank robber fell to the ground, he squeezed off a few more shots. They all went wild. Thankfully, didn't hit any of the customers inside the bank, but were lodged in the ceiling and the walls. And the bank robber, who had been stricken by the first bullet Gifford fired, fell to the ground, but quickly bounced back up as his gun sort of clattered across the floor and made his escape. His accomplice did the same. There was a second bank robber who'd gone into the branch manager's office and kept him covered by a pistol to the ribs. So these two bank robbers fled the building, leaving the first robber's gun behind, which is when one of the customers inside the bank leapt into action too. His name was David Haddow. He grabbed the bank robber's gun off the floor of the bank and then chased them outside onto Broadview Avenue. He found the robbers making their escape down the street. The first one was already jumping into a green sedan, which had been stolen earlier that day, their getaway car, which was being driven by a third outlaw. But the bank robber who'd been shot by the teller was a little slower, still hobbling down the street, at which point Haddow, with the bank robber's own gun, opened fire too. As the car pulled away, he was shooting down the street after it. The police would later find that all his shots hit the mark. There were 4 bullets left in the gun. He fired all 4. 2 into the back of the car, 1 hit the side, another one nicked the fender, but none of them seem to have hit the thieves inside the car. The only one he hit his target with was the one he fired first, before the bandit got into the car, that wounded bank robber. When he fired his first shot, this customer, he saw him seem to stumble. He was sure he'd hit him with a second bullet. The teller got him with one, the customer got him with one, but he was still able to jump in through the open door of the car as it peeled away down Broadview. Even then, the drama wasn't over. The car was almost immediately hit by a streetcar. A couple of guys working for an ice company who just happened to be driving their truck by the intersection at the same time saw the bank robbers fleeing the building and the shootout on Broadview. And so they sped their truck up and tried to ram the getaway car until the streetcar managed to get in between them. And as the sedan took off down Broadway, the ice truck took off after it. It wasn't exactly a chase of breakneck speed. The ice truck had a speed governor on it, which capped its velocity at about 50 kilometers an hour. But they did go as fast as they could, chasing the bank robbers through Cabbagetown, having crossed the Don Valley, until another streetcar got in the way and they lost sight of it. The car was last spotted on Gerrard, just rushing away before it disappeared with the bank robbers in it. It would be found later abandoned in Cabbagetown. The police found the bullet holes, so they knew that customer had hit the car those 4 times, but the bandits themselves had completely disappeared. The bank teller, who'd been shot in the shoulder, he said he barely felt it, but it was actually a pretty serious wound. It had gone through his shoulder, it seems, and broken some of his ribs, punctured his lung. He'd be in bed at Toronto General Hospital for the next 16 days. And even when he got out at the end of those 2.5 weeks, the bandits still hadn't been found. The hunt would last for months. The heist was in August. The first arrest was made in December, and it would be the final arrest. A guy named John Gold from Hamilton was put on trial for the bank robbery, but the witnesses couldn't agree on whether it was him or not. The teller thought for sure it was. A couple of other witnesses did too, but the customer who fired those shots after him swore that John Gold wasn't the right guy. John Gold had an alibi too. So in the end, 2 juries couldn't agree on a verdict, and the Crown eventually just let the case drop. It seems that no one was ever convicted for this rather dramatic crime that was front page news in Toronto. And it, as I say, was far from the only bank robbery in our city's past. When you go back through the newspaper archives and through the Toronto Public Library's digital collection of photos online, which is where it first really started striking me just how often there's a photo of people milling outside a bank, the caption saying that there had just been a heist there. Toronto's a city that is filled with stories of bandits and of bank robbers. And that history goes back deep into the city's past. If you want to look for sort of the very beginnings of these kinds of heists and organized crime in the city, you can go all the way back to the first few decades of its history as a settlement built here on this Indigenous ground, on this Indigenous land. In fact, Toronto's very first mayor, all the way back in the 1830s, so just about 40 years after the city was founded, this guy, William Lyon Mackenzie, he's maybe most famous or infamous for the fact that he's known as the rebel mayor, pushing for Canadian democracy, for democratic reform. He eventually lost patience with peaceful attempts to change things and gathered a rebel army on Yonge Street, marched it down to try to overthrow British rule and establish an independent Canadian republic. And part of that rebellion was kind of highwayman-like activity. In the middle of the rebellion, first week of December 1837, Mackenzie led some of his rebels west of town to this spot. This is the Peacock Tavern, which stood at the edge of the junction, sort of where the intersection between Dundas, DuPont, and Annette, and Old Weston Road all meet in sort of a tangled intersection today. This is where the Peacock Tavern stood in the 1830s. And Mackenzie knew that the Peacock Tavern is where the stagecoach stopped. It was his first stop as it came into the city. And so Mackenzie headed there to catch the stagecoach out of town and hold it up. The rebels robbed the stagecoach of the mail, a serious offense in itself, even if you're overthrowing the government, so that any messages that the government was sending out of Toronto to ask the neighboring communities for help wouldn't make it to their destination. So Toronto's own first mayor once robbed a stagecoach and was a bit of a bandit himself. The rebellion, it didn't last very long. The government crushed it pretty quickly. But some of the systems it had set in place have been pointed to as kind of the origins of organized crime in Toronto. The rebels had all these secret networks between communities so that they could organize this uprising. And after the rebellion was crushed, those networks were then used by a group that became known as the Markham Gang, which is usually pointed to as sort of the early beginnings of organized crime here, the beginning of banditry in our city. They operated all around what's now Southern Ontario and Quebec, including in Toronto, and used, as I say, those networks that had been established for the rebellion as part of their organization and as part of their plan not to get caught. They were mostly petty thieves. They're said to have stolen everything from sort of clothes off laundry lines to eggs out of hens' coops, watches, jewelry, all that kind of just small level stuff for the most part, and then used these secret networks to move the goods so that they wouldn't get caught with stolen goods in the place that they'd stolen it from. And so they would move the goods across the early roads of what back then was known as Upper Canada, Southern Ontario today, hens' eggs and watches and jewelry and clothing, making its way up and down the province so that no one could be caught with a thing they'd stolen in the place where someone could identify those stolen goods. And in the days when it was hard to communicate or travel between these places, that helped ensure that people in the Markham Gang didn't get caught very often. And some of their ideas were ingenious, diabolical schemes. Well, my favorite is what they would do with a stolen horse. So at the higher level, they might steal horses or cattle. And when they did, one of the things they would do is ride that horse out of town as far as they could, along those early roads in the deep of night, trying to get as far away as possible from the farmer that they'd stolen the horse from, and then arrange to meet another bandit, another member of the Markham gang, who had been coordinated with so that that person would also steal a horse that same day and would be riding it in the opposite direction so that they could meet in the middle, in the dead of the night, having ridden as far as they could. And then they would switch horses and ride them back to the town they'd come from. So that the bandit was in the same place they'd started, but the horses were now incredibly far from the place they'd started. In fact, somewhere that was too far for a bandit to have ridden to that place and back again. There was no way the bandit could have ridden all the way to, let's say, Coburg, and then gotten all the way back to Toronto with that stolen horse by himself. So that when the horse showed up in the other town having been stolen, even if they realized it was stolen, it wouldn't be clear who'd done it, because the original bandit couldn't possibly have gotten that far in one night, all the way there and back. But the truth is, they'd only made it halfway, picked up that horse, and got back to where they came from. Sometimes they even added on extra levels to that, where when they arrived in the town with this stolen horse from far away, they would then sell it to a farmer, and the other bandit would show up claiming his horse had been stolen with a description of his accomplice. The farmer, worried about getting arrested for having a stolen horse, would then hand the horse back to the person claiming to be its owner. They could sell the same horse over and over again using this scheme to travel through the countryside, selling it over and over again in new community after new community, saying it was stolen, getting it back, selling it again. The Markham gang had a pretty sophisticated operation going. But the authorities were certainly looking for them and certainly onto them. And every once in a while, things became even more serious than horse thievery. This is where the beginning of the end of the Markham gang happened, which is why they're known as the Markham gang, because of this store in Markham, up Yonge Street, far outside the little city of Toronto back then, which is where it all started falling apart. It began as an ordinary robbery by this guy, Stephen Turney, a member of the gang who wanted to rob this shop belonging to this guy, McPhillips. But it all got out of control. I think McPhillips resisted. And when he did, Stephen Turney grabbed a hammer and bashed in McPhillips's skull, leaving his body behind the counter as he made off with the goods. When the body was discovered, there was enough evidence to tie the crime back to Turney. He was put on trial, kept in Toronto's old jail down next to the Distillery District today, where there's a new Ontario line station going in at Front and Berkeley. He'd been arrested in Toronto, and he would end his life in Toronto too, hanged in Toronto for the crime he had committed in Markham. And that seems to kind of brought an end to the Markham gang. Things had gone a little too far. They were far from the only gang that terrorized Toronto in the middle of the 1800s, though. The Don Valley back then was still outside the city, still a place where you could graze your cows, where there were breweries and mills, but not too much else. And it was a place very much on the edges of society, kind of metaphorically too. A place that was terrorized by a group known as the Brooks Bush Gang. They were sort of headquartered around a patch of forest known as Brooks Bush, around where Withrow Park is today in Riverdale. But their reign of terror included areas far beyond that. They had an old barn and a tavern on Broadview where they'd hang out, but sometimes they'd be committing crimes in the heart of the city. Mostly, again, smaller crimes, though lots of muggings, lots of sex work, thieves, pickpockets, all working together. Lots of them young people, some teenagers even. And this was the spot they were most associated with. This is the old Queen Street Bridge across the Don River. So the same spot where the Queen Street Viaduct stands today, the one that unites Corktown to Riverside, that has that big public art over the bridge about the fact the river you stand in isn't, or the river you step in isn't the one you stand in. That bridge today is on this same spot. In the middle of the 1800s, to get across this bridge meant that you were risking dealing with the Brooks Bush gang, because they haunted this place and even were known to demand tolls from people crossing it, just basically mugging people on the regular. The leader of the Brooks Bush gang seems to be a woman known as Jane Ward officially, but who has one of the best nicknames in the entire history of our city. They called her the Bandit Queen of Riverdale. And the Brooks Bush gang in the middle of the 1800s was a very well-known organization, right up until the point where things again got out of hand. One night, this man was crossing the bridge. John Sheridan Hogan was a member of federal parliament, pretty wealthy guy too. He was staying at a hotel downtown, the Rawson House, but come out here for one reason or another. He knew the drill. Seems to be that when he got to the bridge, he pulled out a wad of cash, knowing he had to pay the gang off and pay that toll to cross the bridge. But it was a pretty big wad of money, unusually big. And so the gang members decided to beat him up and mug him for that wad of cash. And unfortunately for Hogan, he recognized one of them. And as they were beating him up on the bridge, he called out their name, I think calling for help. But that meant he'd identified one of them. So one member of the gang, a guy we think was called James Brown, put a stone inside a handkerchief and knocked Hogan over the head with it, killing him dead. And so over that money and then the threat of the identification, Hogan had been murdered, and they threw his body over the edge of the bridge into the river to try to cover their tracks. Now, Hogan was someone who had a bit of an odd schedule, would often kind of disappear for periods of time. So it was a couple of months before anyone reported him missing, and there was any search for him at all, even though he was an MP. And it wasn't until, I think, about 18 months later that his body was finally found in the Don River, and the real investigation into the murder could begin. It was a big, sensational trial. Jane Ward and James Brown were both tried for the murder of Hogan. In the end, it was James Brown who was found guilty, convicted here at the old courthouse on Adelaide, which is still there today, this building on the left with the columns. It's now the Toroni Italian restaurant. One day in 1861, I believe, a crowd of people gathered outside to witness the very last public execution in Toronto history. And James Brown of the Brooks Bush gang was hanged for that murder on the Queen Street Bridge. There were bank robberies back then, too. The very first ones I've been able to find evidence of so far, though it's something I'm going to keep looking into, are actually a pair of bank robberies that happened at the Bank of Upper Canada, Toronto's oldest bank. It was founded all the way back in the 1820s. But in 1857 and 1858, it was the site of two separate heists. This building is also still there today, stands on Adelaide at Jarvis, just a little east of it, right at George, in fact, not far from Toronto's first post office, right across the street from George Brown College today. In the first bank robbery, when the authorities arrived to begin investigating, they found that the bank didn't seem to be very disordered at all, that it all seemed to have been carried out pretty neatly. They started suspecting it might be an inside job as a result. And then they became even more convinced when they found that the window that had been cut with diamond to get into the room with the money in it had actually been cut from the inside, that it was someone getting out with the money. And so suspicions fell on a man named Moses Cummings, who worked at the bank and who was discovered to have been lending money to people without the proper paperwork or permissions, and had himself ended up deep in debt through this process of lending to people he shouldn't have been, and so seems maybe to have sort of orchestrated at least the look of a bank robbery to cover his own embezzlement and have something to blame it on. Just a year after that, the Bank of Upper Canada was involved in a even more notorious bank robbery. This time it seems to have been a little bit more traditional in terms of a heist. And the thing that made it extra notorious is what happened next and what it did to the reputation of the city's police chief. The guy responsible for the Toronto police at the time, whose office would have been at the old St. Lawrence Market, which was City Hall and the police department back then. The square bit of the building is still part of the modern St. Lawrence Market today, the older building on the south side of front, not the brand new north one. And that's where Samuel Sherwood, our chief of police, worked. He's a man who had an incredibly notorious reputation. He, in his youth, had orchestrated a riot against his political opponents. His brother at the time had just lost an election. And so Sherwood orchestrated an attack on the victory parade of their political enemies, the Reform Party, the Mackenzie's side. A bagpiper was attacked. Sherwood's allies rode into the parade on horses to beat people up. A shot was fired at the window of a tavern that left one of the parade supporters dead in the street. A riot so notorious Charles Dickens wrote about it, having visited Toronto and been told about this notorious scene. He then became police chief and sort of carried on with the same kind of behavior. He was police chief during the notorious circus riot, sparked by a brawl between clowns and firefighters at a brothel on King Street. It then devolved into a big riot at the circus grounds the next day. Samuel Sherwood was the police chief who's dragged his feet and didn't have his officers do much, probably because the rioters and Sherwood and the rest of the police force were all members of the Orange Order, the Protestant fraternal organization that ran things in Toronto for more than a century, beginning in this era. In fact, when the Orange Order once attacked an Irish Catholic parade, the Orange Order being a deeply Protestant anti-Catholic organization, and an Irish Catholic stablehand was pitchforked to death, Sherwood refused to testify because he didn't want to have to name Orange Order members he witnessed carry out the murder. So that was Samuel Sherwood's reputation going into this bank robbery. And so he's the one responsible for investigating it. And not long after the bank robbery, the bank robbers show up and bring the money back to Samuel Sherwood, apparently hoping they'd be able to get away with the crime as long as the money was returned. And then that's exactly what happened. Sherwood questioned them for a while, took the money back, and then just let them all go. All three suspects were released. Maybe, you suspect, because they were members of the Orange Order too. And so this became a huge scandal that Samuel Sherwood had just taken the money but let the suspects go. It was a massive news item at the time. The Globe declared that the chief had proved his incompetence was equaled only by his impertinence and general bad conduct. And it wasn't just the Globe. The people running the city and the province agreed. There'd already been big investigations into Sherwood, and now this bank robbery kind of cemented his reputation and the fact that he had to go. And it wasn't just him. The entire police force that he ran was more used to joining riots than putting them down, was sort of corruptly being run by the Orange Order. The Globe said that the whole police system was radically bad. And in the end, the authorities, the provincial and city government, ended up moving in quite a dramatic way to try to clean things up. Not only was Samuel Sherwood fired after the bank robbery, but the entire Toronto police force, every single officer, was let go, and they just restarted the entire police force from scratch. Though, in the end, some of the officers were rehired, and those systems of Orange Order power would last for another century to come. Over the course of that century, Toronto grew from a sort of muddy, wooden sidewalked kind of frontier town in the middle of the 1800s into a big, booming Victorian metropolis, and then into a city of the 20th century. And all through this period, from what I can tell looking back through the newspaper archives, which the library also wonderfully has digitized online, you can go search through old issues of the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail. So a lot of the research for this is just searching bank robbery and bandit in those archives, which is a wonderful way to spend a day. This whole period, there don't seem to have been too many bank robberies. Most of the robberies reported by our newspapers in Toronto are stories about things happening in other cities, and there's usually one big story happening at a time. When the paper reports on the bank robbery, you're kind of expected to know which one they're talking about in the late 1800s, because they seem to be relatively rare. There were big ones in Napanee and Kingston, across the border in the States, and Montreal too. But it's not until you get to the 1920s, the 30s, the 40s, and into the middle of the 1900s, the bank robberies in Toronto suddenly start to become regular news. There was headline after headline after headline through decades of Toronto's history about armed bank robberies happening all across the city. I want to learn more, in fact, about what inspired it. Some of it might be that you're more easily able to move from city to city. We've got cars now too, which makes getting away more easily. At least one bank robbing team who was arrested in Toronto after having robbed a bank in the States admitted that it was movies that had inspired them to do it, that it was tales of Hollywood drama that inspired their own crime spree. And it's the era that Toronto's most famous bank robberies take place in, including some of the most notorious as well. And there are two more big bank robberies I want to spend sort of the second half of our time together today talking about. By this point, the head of law enforcement in Toronto, it's all centered here at the city's new City Hall back then, which we call Old City Hall now. Not only was it home to the mayor's office and city council, it was also home to lots of government departments, including the police force and courts, which was part of what Old City Hall did right up until it closed a few months ago. Still home to big, famous court cases, even in recent years, when Keith Richards was arrested for drug possession in Toronto, he had to show up at Old City Hall courts. When Jimi Hendrix was arrested for drug possession, he did too. right up to Sandro Lisi, the associate of the Ford brothers, who had his trial there in the wake of all the crack smoking scandal just years ago. And by the point that I'm talking about, sort of the golden era of bank robberies in Toronto history, this was our police chief. This is Dennis Draper, who is potentially the most notorious police chief in Toronto history, which is saying something, given that we just met Samuel Sherwood, one old crime reporter in Toronto who wrote for the Star, Jocko Thomas, said that it was Dennis Draper who was the most incompetent and clownish chief Toronto ever had. He was caught up in scandal after scandal after scandal, but amazingly, none of them ever seemed to have really stuck to him. Writing in Torontoist a few years ago, Kevin Plummer said he seemed impervious to criticism or consequence. And that included when it came to bank robberies. Now, Draper, he was brought in to kind of overhaul the force again. This is now about 70 years after Samuel Sherwood and the robbery at the Bank of Upper Canada. They've decided that the police force needs to be overhauled once again. 70 years ago, they fired everyone and started over. This time, they thought they needed to bring someone in who might be able to break some of the orange stranglehold, the orange order's power over the force, and to make it a more disciplined force as well. Dennis Draper had no policing experience, but he did have military experience, having fought in the First World War. And so a lot of what he did with the Toronto Police Force is to make it more military. He started the mounted police unit that became known as Draper's Dragoons. He started a Red Squad to crack down on communism, one of the more notorious episodes in the history of the Toronto police. Police started acting a lot more like soldiers, but at the same time, getting caught up in controversy and scandal. And part it was that militarism. When they broke up a communist meeting at Queen's Park in brutal fashion, there were calls for Draper's resignation. He helped push the police board to ban public speeches in Toronto that weren't spoken in English. If the police found you giving a public speak in another language, they could have you arrested because they said, if you were going to talk about communism, which to them was treason, well, if you were going to be treasonous, they needed you to do it in English because they couldn't understand any other language. So they wouldn't know that you were saying treason unless you spoke it in English. And he was caught up in personal scandals too. He was once arrested for dangerous driving when a federal cabinet minister's son, I believe, was caught for drunk driving, having caused a terrible, fatal accident. Draper just let that guy go because he was well connected. But none of that stuck to our Teflon police chief. Instead, the biggest scandals associated with his name came many years after he was first hired, and one of them revolves around a bank robbery. This is the old Royal Bank branch at Church and Wellesley, now in the heart of the village, where one day in 1940, I believe, this very same year, oh no, I'm wrong about that, 1933, sorry, two bank robbers arrived with a plan to hold this place up. Their names were William Toohey and Albert Dorland. They both staked the place out, prepared to go inside. There are different versions of the story. Some say Dorland even went in to try to check the place out. But he was feeling really nervous about it. He thought something was off. He saw some faces in the windows, someone reading a newspaper nearby, which felt a little suspicious to him. Some say when he went inside the bank, he asked the teller, "Are there any cops around?" And the teller asked him why he was asking him that. A pretty terrible question to get asked if you're a bank teller in a city plagued by bank robberies. And Dorland decided he didn't like the sound of any of it. And so he told Toohey that he thought they should make a run for it. "Come on, let's get out of here," he told him. "It's a plant." That he thought the whole thing, someone had tipped off the cops and that they were waiting for them. And so As he said, the coppers were all around the place, and they made a run for it and tried to escape. Dorland was right. The police had been tipped off. They were staking out the bank. They were waiting for the robbery to take place so that then they could catch the bandits red-handed. And so when the bank robbers ran, the police then leapt into action themselves. They started firing. Maybe 10 or 20 gunshots rang out as the police tried to hit the bank robbers, and the bank robbers responded too. Dorland, driving the car, tried to ram, in fact, did ram one of the police cars. The shots were flying back and forth. When it went quiet, the police went up to the car. They found Dorland had been hit. In fact, he was nearly dead. When they opened the car door, he slumped out of his seat onto the sidewalk. He was lucky to survive. He said one of the bullets had burned his skin on his head. It had sliced right past his skull. And so Dorland and Toohey were both arrested and put on trial. The police were criticized a bit for the shootout because there were bystanders there. No one really on the street when it began, but the sound of the shooting brought people out onto their balconies, at their windows, onto the street, and someone easily could have been hurt who was perfect innocent in the whole scene. But it's when the trial began that things started seeming really weird. Dorland was sentenced to 5 years in prison the very next day. That's how quick court cases used to happen in Toronto. But that seemed pretty strange to Dorland's mother, because she seems to have known that Dorland made a plea bargain. He pled guilty, having been promised he'd only get 1 year in prison for the bank heist, but had gotten 5 instead. No one seems to have told the judge about the plea deal. And so Dorland's mother hired a lawyer to start looking into the case and sort of the aftermath of this heist. And Frank Regan, that lawyer, he started uncovering even more than he ever imagined he would. Turned out that the story of this bank heist at Church and Wellesley went back further than anyone knew when that court case was happening. By this point, 1933, the Toronto Police have moved out of Old City Hall, and they have a new headquarters here in the Stewart Building, designed by E.J. Lennox, our greatest Victorian architect. It's still there today, right near Queen's Park Station, sort of west on College, yellow brick building. It's actually been in the news a bit recently because they're planning to stick pretty unsympathetic condo on top of this building sometime soon. And it's where Chief Draper and the police were headquartered as we move toward this heist. And one day, a guy arrived at the police department whose name was William Toohey, our second bank robber. And he told Draper and the police that he knew someone who was asking him to join in on planning a heist. And he was turning police informer and tipping the cops off. And Draper and Toohey and other top brass at the Toronto Police had a whole series of meetings about the situation. And remarkably, it was the Toronto Police who seemed to have given Toohey and Dorland the guns they needed to pull off the heist. Some sources say they gave them the guns directly, others that they gave them the money they needed to do it. But one way or the other, it seems to have been Chief Draper who was responsible for arming the armed bank robbers. In fact, some people back then suspected that the police were waiting for the robbery to take place because, it being an armed heist, they could burst in, shoot Dorland dead, and claim that they'd had no choice to do it because he was armed. But it turned out those arms were from the police themselves. There was a huge outcry, massive scandal, a big royal commission into this heist and how it had happened. That royal commission found that Chief Draper had contributed to crime by ensuring that those bank robbers were armed when they approached that bank that day. And that was only the beginning of what must have been the worst month of Draper's career. He's maybe most often mentioned these days for what happened just a few weeks later at Christie Pitts. It was that same month that the Christie Pitts riot broke out, with Toronto's Nazis facing off against Torontonian Jewish ball players, their Italian Canadian allies, and maybe the single most infamous riot in Toronto history, and one that broke out in part because there was so little police presence at a game where everyone knew there was going to be trouble, where the Nazis had unfurled a swastika banner just the day before. Draper admitted he had been tipped off, given warnings about the riot, but had only sent a handful of police officers there, since his focus was much more on anti-communist work than on anti-fascist work. There were more calls for Draper's resignation, but again, no real consequences for him. Instead, it would be many years before he finally retired. He was a police chief all through the Second World War. It wasn't until 1946, and the months after the war ended, that Draper finally agreed to retire, though he stayed on an advisory post with a salary for another 5 years beyond that, well into his late 70s, even though you were supposed to retire as a Toronto police officer at the age of 70 itself. And so he would have still been an advisor when Toronto's most notorious gang of bank robbers began their own reign. The most famous or infamous bank robber in Toronto history is one who, if you've signed up for this talk, might be someone whose story you're already familiar with. He had actually fought in the Second World War. He had grown up, had a bit of trouble with the police himself. His dad was actually a police officer. And this guy's name was Edwin Alonzo Boyd. And when he came home at the end of the war, he, like so many veterans, found that he was having a hard time. A lot of these soldiers were plagued by the memories of what they'd seen and what they'd done, suffering from PTSD, and lots of them couldn't find steady work either. And that includes Edwin Alonzo Boyd. He was trying to make ends meet, trying to support his family, but within a few years of returning from the war, he'd given up on the idea of a life of innocence and had instead decided to embrace crime. He practiced for a while, made sure he honed the skills he'd learned in the war before deploying them on his first bank heist, which happened here on Avenue Road near Wilson. This building's still there today too. This lecture's just full of them. It's now, I think, painted black. It's a restaurant last time I saw. It was here that Boyd walked in at the end of the 1940s and went up to the bank teller and grabbed him. It was this guy, George Elwood, grabbed this bank manager and handed him a note that read, "If you don't want to be a dead hero, fill this sack with money," pushing I think a sugar sack across the counter to him. The manager, Elwood, took it, stepped on an alarm, turned to another bank teller, handed it to them. They stepped on alarm too, handed them the note. And they filled the sack with money. Boyd demanded that they get into the vault too, or the big safe. They told him that it was empty, and he took them at their word, started backing out of the bank, gun in hand, and out onto the street, onto the sidewalk, onto Avenue Road. At which point, this bank manager, just like Gifford Hobday before him, decided to try to be a hero. He also had a gun in his desk, so he grabbed it and ran out onto Avenue Road after Boyd, shooting his gun wildly down the street. All of his bullets missed their mark. One of them, as you can see here, hit this guy's car. He got out of his car, furious, started screaming at the bank manager about what was going on. The bank manager screaming back at him about how there'd been a holdup. Meanwhile, the whole time, Boyd's making his escape. He sprinted across Avenue Road and off into the residential neighborhood beyond. He was jumping over backyard fences, making this dramatic escape. A boy actually tried to chase him for a while on a bicycle before finally losing sight of him. Boyd slipped away uncaught. It was the first in a long series of bank heists. Over the course of the next 2 years, Boyd, working often with others, managed to pull off 6 more heists. And it wasn't until more than a half dozen of these bank robberies that Boyd was finally caught and found himself here at the Don jail. The thing about prison, though, is that it's filled with criminals. And so Boyd, at the Don jail, rather than being reformed, instead made connections. He met some other bank robbers at the Don, including Lenny Jackson and Willie Jackson, who were remarkably not related to each other. It's just a coincidence that their names were both Jackson. And they, with Boyd, came up with a plan to escape the Don jail. Lenny had an accident with a train at one point, had lost a leg and had a prosthetic. So they managed, incredibly, to smuggle in a hacksaw blade inside Lenny Jackson's prosthetic leg, which allowed them to saw through the bars of a prison window. They tied a bunch of sheets together and dropped out the window, climbed down it into the exercise yard, sprinted across it, used the sheets with lasso at the top to hook the top of the prison wall, climb up it, and then jump the 16 feet down into freedom, where another associate, this guy, who was using an alias, Steve Sukan, was waiting for them with a getaway car that they had managed to break out of the Don. And so they went on another bank heist spree. They managed 4 more over the course of the next 4 months, including this Royal Bank branch in Leslieville. But the police were very much looking for them, and the noose was slowly closing. Willie Jackson, in fact, while laying low in Montreal, was turned in. Someone recognized him and turned him into the police. He was arrested there. And 2 others would have a dramatic standoff here, at the corner of Lansdowne and College, not far from Roncesvalles. We're at the spot where College meets Dundas. That's Dundas in the distance there. They were stopped by a police officer right at that corner, who approached their car. This is their exact car in this photo. His name was Edmund Tong. And we got to the car, the Boyd Gang members panicked. That's the name they were known as by the press at this point. Even though it was one of the Jacksons who was the real leader of the gang, it was Edwin Alonzo Boyd, who had the movie star good looks and the dashing reputation. And so they were known as the Boyd Gang. And it was the Boyd Gang who would end Edmund Tong's life. They panicked at this police check, shot Edmund Tong dead. It would take him a long time to die in hospital, and then started firing on his police car where his partner was still sitting in the seat. His partner, too, would end up in the hospital with serious injuries. And now the Boyd Gang were even more wanted than they had been before. Edmund Tong would end up having a big public funeral. There were people lined up on the street outside as it happened, members of the public mourning his loss. And this hunt for the 3 remaining Boyd Gang members was very much underway. They again headed to Montreal to lay low, where there was a dramatic shootout in the luxury apartment where Steve Sukan was staying. He was lucky to survive that shootout. A bullet just missed his heart by an inch. He was laid up in a hospital bed under arrest. The other, Jackson, he was part of another shootout. They say the police fired 200 bullets, 3 of which hit him. He was also under arrest in prison. Boyd was the only one left. He was holed up at his brother's house here on Heath Street near Yonge, a house that is also still there today, and where Boyd was holed up, trying to lead a quiet life not be noticed. But the police were tipped off again. And Toronto's most famous detective of the age, Adolphus Payne, a guy who's been called Canada's greatest detective. He was nicknamed Trigger because he once managed to get a bandit to drive off a road by firing a single shot in his direction, but is also part of some of Toronto's most notorious stories. He once arrested a boy for being a serial killer, and it turned out he had the wrong boy. It was part of a serial killer spree known as The Boy on the Bicycle. Nate Hendley has a really good book about it and about Payne's involvement in it. But this would be Payne's most famous moment. He waited until the dead of night, until just before dawn, and then he snuck into Boyd's house, backed up by many other officers, went right up to Boyd's bedside while Boyd was asleep, put his gun to his head, and woke him up with the line, "Boyd, it's Payne. Give up." And Boyd did. Even Boyd had to admit that Payne had done a good job. He found himself back in the Don jail. This is him in his jail cell. But amazingly, they put another member of the Boyd gang in the cell next to him. And the two Jacksons were there as well. Him and Sukon and Jackson all got together and planned a second escape. There are lots of stories about how it happened. The most often told is that one of them let himself get so thin, so weakened by hunger, refused to eat so much that his skin got really soft and pliable. They made friends with one of the guards and jokingly one day, since they were such friends with him, playfully grabbed at his keys. Haha, as if we're trying to escape. But one of the Boyd gang's members, his skin was so plastic that the key left a shape in his palm. They were able to then trace that shape on a piece of paper, make a key, and break out of the Don jail once again. A second escape for the Boyd gang, which is part of why they're such a big part of the city's history. They were now, again, the most wanted men in Toronto, in Canada. In fact, it was the Boyd gang who became the very first news item ever reported on CBC television, because it just happened to launch that very same day. The final standoff eventually took place at a barn up in the northeast, I think Shepherd and Leslie or so. And finally, the Boyd gang was brought in for good. Two were sentenced and hanged for the death of the police officer, Edmund Tong, while Edwin Alonzo Boyd, since he hadn't been present for that murder, instead was sent to the Kingston Penitentiary, where he spent many years before being released, moved to the West Coast, and lived to the rest of his life there. Though, right up to the end, he had that notorious reputation. And one author who wrote a book about him, a biography of him, interviewing him at the end of his life, said that he admitted there were crimes he should have been hanged for too, which this author thinks was the unsolved murder of a couple whose bodies were found in this car in High Park just before Boyd's first bank heist. That while he was practicing for the heist, he accidentally was discovered by them, who were having their own tryst. George Vigas was cheating on his wife with a much younger Iris Scott, since they'd accidentally stumbled upon Boyd practicing his skills for the bank heists. He decided he needed to murder them and took them off to High Park. We'll never know whether that's true, which is just one more mystery around some of these bank robberies, and a reminder that while they are these dramatic, engaging tales, the stakes behind them are incredibly real, and that it's often a matter of life and death. So thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry I've gone 2 minutes over. We've got one more of these Toronto's most notorious talks left. We're doing bootleggers and smugglers next. It's just a couple of weeks away. Same time, Friday, July 11th. And I thought I'd mention very briefly, in addition to being able to register for that for free, I've got a couple of free talks coming up this weekend as part of the Motive Festival. Tomorrow I'm talking about Toronto's Victorian underworld, which will be some of the stories I shared as part of this series last month. And on Sunday, I'm talking about a brief history of Canadian duels. I also have a Canada Day tour coming up on Canada Day at 3 p.m., all about cross-border tensions and our sort of up and down relationship with the United States. So hopefully some of you can make one of the other events we've got coming up. And again, we're doing Bootleggers and Smugglers on July 11th. And again, thank you all so much for tuning in, and to Sergio and the Toronto Public Library for having us.